March 22nd, 1975, 12:17 a.m. Dylan's farmhouse, Woodstock, New York. The phone rang in Bob Dylan's isolated Woodstock home, cutting through the silence of a bitter winter night. Dylan had been up late, struggling with writer's block, when the unexpected call shattered his solitude. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion who had been stripped of everything for standing up to a war he couldn't support. But this wasn't the confident, poetic Ali the world knew. This was a broken man calling the only person he believed might understand what it felt like to sacrifice everything for your principles. What happened in their conversation that night, and in the days that followed, would create one of the most powerful collaborations in the history of protest art, and prove that sometimes the greatest victories happen far from any ring or stage. "Bob," Ali's voice was barely above a whisper, lacking the rhythmic confidence that had made him famous. "It's Muhammad. I need to talk to someone. I didn't know who else to call." Dylan was immediately alert. He had followed Ali's case closely, watched as the greatest athlete in the world was stripped of his boxing license, his livelihood, and his prime years for refusing to fight in Vietnam. "Muhammad, of course. What's going on, man?" "They destroyed me, Bob." Ali's voice cracked with exhaustion and despair. 3 years. 3 years since they took away my license, and I'm running out of hope. I gave up everything, my career, my money, my prime, for my beliefs. And for what? The war's still going. Kids are still dying, and I'm sitting here at 33, feeling like an old man who threw his life away. Dylan felt his heart break for his friend. Ali hadn't just lost his boxing license in 1967. He had been vilified by the press, stripped of his heavyweight title, and faced with potential imprisonment for draft evasion. All because he had said what millions of young Americans were thinking: "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." "Muhammad, you didn't throw your life away. You showed the world what courage looks like." "Did I?" Ali asked, his voice filled with doubt that the public had never heard. "Because right now, I feel like a fool. I could have gone along with it, done my time, come back, and still had my career. Instead, I lost the best years of my athletic life fighting lawyers and judges instead of opponents in the ring." Dylan had never heard Ali sound so defeated. The man who had proclaimed himself the greatest now sounded like he was questioning everything he had ever believed about himself. "Where are you right now?" Dylan asked. "Chicago. In my apartment. Alone. I sent my wife and kids to stay with her family because I didn't want them to see me like this." "Like what?" "Like a man who's lost his way. Bob, I used to know exactly who I was and what I stood for. Now I don't even know if I'm a boxer anymore, if I'm an activist, if I'm anything. They took away my identity when they took away my title." Dylan understood that feeling intimately. The pressure of being seen as a voice of a generation, the weight of other people's expectations, the difficulty of staying true to yourself when the whole world has opinions about who you should be. "Muhammad, can I tell you something?" "Please." "Your courage inspired my music. When you stood up to the draft board, when you said you wouldn't fight for a country that wouldn't fight for your people's rights, you gave voice to something millions of us were feeling, but didn't know how to say. But what good did it do? The war's still happening. Nothing changed. Everything changed. You proved that it's possible to choose principles over profit, conscience over convenience. You showed a generation of young people that they didn't have to go along with something they knew was wrong, even if it cost them everything. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Bob, can I ask you something?" Anything. Do you ever regret speaking out? Do you ever wish you had just stuck to love songs and left the politics alone? Dylan thought about his own journey. The booze at Newport when he went electric, the criticism from folk purists, the constant pressure to be a spokesman for causes he sometimes didn't fully understand. Every day, Dylan admitted. But then I remember that the music that matters, the music that lasts, comes from telling the truth. And the truth is rarely comfortable. I'm scared, Bob, Ali said, his voice barely audible. Scared that I made the biggest mistake of my life. Scared that I'll never fight again. Scared that I sacrificed everything for nothing. Dylan made a decision that would surprise them both. Mohammed, I'm driving to Chicago. Tonight. Don't go anywhere. What? Bob, you don't have to. Yes, I do. When someone who inspired my music needs help, I help. I'll be there by morning. Dylan hung up the phone, threw some clothes in a bag, and began the long drive from Woodstock to Chicago. He drove through the night, thinking about courage and sacrifice, about what it means to stand up for your beliefs when the cost is everything you've worked for. When Dylan knocked on Ali's apartment door at 7 a.m., the man who answered was barely recognizable as the charismatic champion who had dazzled the world. Ali looked thin, tired, and older than his 33 years. You actually came, Ali said, embracing Dylan with tears in his eyes. I told you I would. They spent the morning talking, really talking, not the surface conversation of celebrities, but the deep, honest communication of two men who had paid enormous prices for their principles. Ali told Dylan about the financial struggles, about having to take speaking engagements at small colleges just to pay his bills, about watching younger fighters take opportunities that should have been his. Dylan told Ali about his own struggles with identity and purpose, about the difficulty of being true to yourself when everyone wants you to be something else. And then Dylan did something that would change Ali's life. Mohammed, you keep talking about what you've lost. But what if we talked about what you've gained? What have I gained? I've lost everything. You've gained something no other athlete has ever had. Moral authority. When you speak now, people don't just hear a great boxer. They hear a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed. Dylan pulled out his guitar, which he had brought from the car. I want to write a song with you, about your journey, your courage, your sacrifice, about what it means to choose conscience over career. Ali looked skeptical. I don't know anything about writing songs. You know about poetry. You know about rhythm. You've been writing songs every time you've spoken about your beliefs. For the next 6 hours, they worked together on what would become one of Dylan's most powerful protest songs. Ali shared his experiences, the moment he decided to refuse induction, the phone call telling him his license was suspended, the nights when he wondered if he had destroyed his life for nothing. Dylan helped Ali turn those experiences into lyrics that captured not just one man's struggle, but the struggle of anyone who has ever had to choose between security and principle. The song they created was called The Price of Truth, and it was unlike anything Dylan had written before. Ali's voice, both literally and figuratively, was woven throughout, creating something that was part folk song, part spoken word performance, part prayer. When they finished, Ali looked at Dylan with wonder. I never thought my story could sound like that, like it mattered. It does matter. Your story is the story of moral courage, and that's a story the world needs to hear. But Dylan wasn't done helping his friend. Over the next 3 days, Dylan stayed in Chicago, and together they organized something unprecedented. a series of small, intimate concerts at colleges and community centers, with all proceeds going to support Ali's legal defense fund. Dylan performed, but the real star was Ali. He spoke to audiences about his decision to refuse the draft, about the cost of standing up for your beliefs, about the importance of staying true to yourself even when the world is against you. At first, Ali was nervous about speaking without the protection of his boxing persona, but Dylan coached him, helping him find the same authenticity in his speaking that he had found in their songwriting. "Don't try to be Muhammad Ali, the boxer," Dylan told him before their first joint appearance. "Be Muhammad Ali, the man who chose conscience over convenience. That's who people need to hear from." The response was overwhelming. Audiences that came to see Bob Dylan left, having heard something more powerful, the testimony of a man who had given up everything for his principles and was still standing. Word of their collaboration spread quickly. Within weeks, other artists began reaching out to Ali, offering support and solidarity. The anti-war movement, which had sometimes kept Ali at arm's length because of his controversial religious beliefs, began to embrace him as a symbol of moral courage. Most importantly, Ali began to remember who he was and why his sacrifice had mattered. 3 months after that midnight phone call, Ali received the news that would change everything. The Supreme Court had agreed to hear his case. The legal battle that had consumed 3 years of his life was finally nearing its end. In June 1975, the Supreme Court overturned Ali's conviction in a unanimous decision. He was free to fight again, his exile was over, and his vindication was complete. The first person Ali called after receiving the news was Bob Dylan. "Bob, they did it. The Supreme Court overturned everything. I can fight again." "Muhammad, that's incredible. How do you feel?" "Grateful, but not just for getting my license back. Grateful for that night you drove to Chicago. Grateful for helping me remember who I am and why I made the choices I made. You never needed me to remind you of who you are. You just needed someone to listen while you remembered it yourself." Ali's comeback fight took place in October 1975 against Jerry Quarry in Atlanta. Dylan was there, sitting ringside, watching his friend reclaim not just his career, but his identity. When Ali won the fight in the 3rd round, he pointed to Dylan and mouthed the words, "Thank you." The friendship between Dylan and Ali continued for decades. Ali would often call Dylan when he was struggling with the physical effects of his boxing career, and Dylan would remind him that his greatest victories had happened outside the ring. In interviews, Ali rarely spoke specifically about that night in March 1975, but those close to him said it marked a turning point in his relationship with his own legacy. "Bob helped me understand that losing everything and then finding it again made me stronger than I ever was when I had everything to begin with," Ali said in a 1978 interview. Dylan was characteristically more cryptic. "Muhammad showed me that the greatest fight is always the one you have with yourself, to stay true to who you are when the whole world wants you to be someone else." The song they wrote together, "The Price of Truth," was never officially recorded or released. But bootleg versions circulated among anti-war activists and civil rights workers, becoming an unofficial anthem for anyone